Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. People have been asking, when does this podcast come out? And the answer is it's every Friday. To which you might say, but Leo, today is Sunday. Yes, and sometimes it comes out on Sundays. Sometimes it doesn't come out for 2 weeks or even 3, and sometimes I put out 2 in a week. It's yes and. Sometimes people ask me, is it a music podcast? Is it a jazz podcast? What is it? I say, yes, it is a music podcast. And it's also sometimes a jazz podcast. Sometimes it's a jazz adjacent podcast. And sometimes it's about the creative life. It's yes and. Yes and is an idea that I learned when I was hanging out around improvisational theater people, and particularly improvisational comedy people, as an impressionable young man in Madison, Wisconsin. I discovered this group of players at Comedy Sports on State Street in Madison. They performed every weekend above a Wendy's, in the upstairs space of a Wendy's, and it was some of the funniest, smartest, fastest, most ferocious performance I ever saw. You know, I understand when you're a young person, everything resonates on a level that it's very hard to get back to later on in your life. And this may be the case, but my memory of it was that was as good as it ever got. And I was so proud after having gone through the workshops and becoming a groupie and even being a musical accompanist for them. I was so proud that this group of these Comedy Sports players made the move. They all kind of moved together from Madison to New York, and they set up shop in the East Village, and they started to really be part of a scene in the early 90s in New York. I was just amazed that they had done it, you know, and I followed their successes and their failures and their triumphs and their defeats and their trajectory. You know, in another world, in another version of my life, I could really see that I would have tried to do something in comedy. I just loved comedy. I loved improv comedy. I loved improv theater, and I loved stand-up, and I think we're all better off for me not trying to do that. I think in some ways I just was too well adjusted. I don't mean that in any kind of disparaging way, only to say I just think I lacked the kind of angst and compulsion that so many people in comedy have. Although on the other hand, the Comedy Sports thing was quite light and almost innocent and naive. It was a family show, and even when the Comedy Sports guys kind of pivoted and transitioned into sketch comedy, it started a group out here in New York called the Bert Ferschners, there was still something quite naive about it. It was able to be kind of subversive and provocative, and at the same time totally PG and kind of cheery in a funny way. My guest today is Mark Hervey. He's one of these Comedy Sports guys who I met in the late 80s when I was just like a new teenager. And he moved to New York years ago as part of the great comedy migration from Madison to New York. And I've just been in touch with him over the years. He's no longer a comedy person, really. He's a video editor now. He's a reality TV video editor. And he called me a couple of months ago and asked to tell me a story. So we went out for a drink, and he told me this story that he's going to tell here today. And I almost immediately felt that it would be something that would be worthwhile to tell on the podcast. Because although it's a little bit out of the ordinary for what I normally do, it's really not so different. It speaks to the intersection of life and work. It speaks to a reality that resonates with me as an independent creative professional. It touches on that area where when your work and your values collide, when something happens to you professionally that feels personal, how challenging that can be to manage. And I encouraged him to just have the same basic conversation with me again on the podcast. So a couple of months later, he came over and we talked it down. But before he told the story that we're going to get to, I wanted to kind of cover the narrative starting on State Street in Madison in the late 80s of these Comedy Sports players and how they got to New York and what the New York was that they discovered when they arrived and how they slotted into the kind of alt comedy scene of the early 90s and how he sees the evolution of that world and his small but not insignificant contribution to, I think, what happened. So there's not much more I want to tell you about it. I encourage you to just settle in and go on this ride with us because the back half of the conversation goes to some pretty special and interesting places. Third-story.com is the website, as you know. Sign up, subscribe, check out the episode index, where, as you will be reminded, it's not all just jazz and jazz-adjacent people, and it's not just every Friday. Is it too broad? Maybe it's too broad, but it is what it is. It's a thing unto itself. Also, Patreon, patreon.com/thirdstorypodcast. That's where you can support this project on a deeper level. And you can also, from third-story.com, find all my socials. Instagram, I'm there. Facebook, I'm there. Twitter, there. YouTube, sometimes. SoundCloud, on and off. Pretty much. All of that. All those buttons you can click on are at third-story.com. All right, without further preamble, here's my conversation with my friend, Mark Hervey. Mark Hervey, I have to say.
Yes.
I am so happy to have you here. There's so many things I want to talk to you about. I know that we have a sort of an excuse for getting together here, but the fact is, in thinking about talking to you, I think there's a great story that I want to talk to you about that ends with you sitting in the room with me today, but actually starts. I'm just going to set you up with what I know. It starts on State Street in Madison, Wisconsin, in the mid to late 80s. In the upstairs rec room space of a Wendy's.
Oh, a Pizza Hut.
Originally a Pizza Hut.
Originally a Pizza Hut. I remember that's where I first met you and
my parents. Yeah. You were in Comedy Sports.
I was in Comedy Sports, an improv comedy group.
In thinking about it and trying to sort of frame it, it seems like Comedy Sports was kind of tied loosely to a mentality that would sort of become UCB, or you know what I mean, in the sort of the world of comedy and sketch comedy today.
Right. I mean, we were very intrinsically linked back then. In fact, one of their original members, Ian, was a member of Comedy Sports in Milwaukee, Milwaukee was the first Comedy Sports. Madison was the second, founded by Dick Chudnow, one of the original members of the Kentucky Fried Theater. Oh, right. The Abrams Zucker. Yeah. He was a part of that whole thing.
So the Midwest, the Wisconsin legacy of improvisational and sketch comedy, it runs deep.
Yeah, it runs deep. It runs deep and has a lot of branches and roots there. The comedy thing, it was even a mistake that I ended up doing it. Like, I was more of a musician. Honestly, I was playing in bands all through college, and the band that I was playing in, we shared a house together in downtown Madison. We had a studio in the basement, and we had gone to see this comedy show, and
to see Comedy Sports?
Yeah, see Comedy Sports, and it was hilarious. It was great, and one of the guys in my band was like, well, let's sign up for the workshops. And so there was a workshop coming up on a Sunday afternoon where you go and you learn some improv games. And it turns out that Sunday, he had to drop out and he wasn't going to even go. And the only reason I signed up was so he had a buddy to go with. And so I stopped. I was like, I'm just not going to go. And then it was supposed to happen at 2:30 and it was 2:00. And I'm like, well, I'm not doing anything anyway. I might as well just walk over there. And so
you go into this Pizza Hut.
So I go to this Pizza Hut in the back room, and there I meet Mike Rock, who was running it, and Pat Walsh, another guy. And a good friend of mine was doing it, Brian Capel, and these other kids from West High School, like Josh Lewis and Cohen Bailey, Chris Tallman. It was like the funnest thing I'd ever done. It was just sort of a fluke it changed my life completely.
And you're in college at the time?
I was finishing.
My memory is 87, 88, I start going as a middle schooler, and I became obsessed with the Comedy Sports show. By the time I got really into it, it was above the Wendy's. It was across the street, and it moved upstairs.
Right. Okay.
And I would go, I had my birthday parties there. I would go as much as I possibly could. I did the workshops also. I didn't do like a teen workshop. I did the kind of college-age workshop. I was definitely the youngest person in these workshops. I remember doing the games, laughing so hard that I would have to run off stage through the space to the back to pee before I peed in my pants from laughing so hard. But the other thing that I remember, of course I was 13, 14, and 15, was that it was really good that crew, that generation. So if I started going in 87, 88, you were 3 years into it already.
Yeah.
It was so smart and so funny and so world class. And of course, the first cut is the deepest, and you never fall in love like you do the first time. But I don't know that I've ever seen anything since then that was as fast and funny and smart as those shows I saw upstairs at Wendy's.
It sounds kind of weird when you say upstairs at Wendy's and at Pizza Hut. Like it's where we found space to perform, and they appreciated the business and whatever. But you're like, there was some sort of something happening there. Like literally, the trust that we had with each other. Improv all comes down to trust. I mean, it's jazz, it's comedy, it's jazz, it's comedy jazz.
Yeah, yep.
You're riffing off each other. You have a structure, just like you might have
a song.
Yep. But within that structure, anything goes.
Yeah.
And so when you have that trust, it's magical. And that group of people that came out of there was really special at that time.
By the time I found you, you're a couple of years out of college. You'd stayed in Madison. It seems like a lot of folks did stay in Madison and were kind of there because of their commitment to comedy sports.
Yeah, I was working, out of college, really my job was, I was working as a technical writer. I had a degree in English. I fell into this job writing manuals for a company that had built bone scanners, of all things. But the comedy thing sort of took over my life, and I was like, and the full-time job thing, they kept asking me to work more hours. Eventually, I was just like, no, I can't. And I quit my job and told my parents I was going to pursue comedy.
And were you funny? Did you get a sense that you were funny before you walked into that workshop that one day?
You know what? I loved making people laugh, and I always, I don't think I had ever internalized it or thought about it, but I had joke books as a kid, and I would drive my sisters crazy. This is, how do we even bring this guy up today? I loved Bill Cosby.
Yeah, right.
and as conflicted as I am about that now, I can't deny his influence as a storyteller. Somebody who was just hilarious. I had memorized some of his bits.
The irony is that he was so clean. He worked so clean. You couldn't take any offense or issue with anything that he said in the act. And ironically, here we are. We're not even comfortably able to say his name because off stage he was a dirty, horrible man. But on stage he worked clean, and it was clever and brilliant.
Yeah, exactly. So it's we all come face to face with the demise of our heroes at some point in our lives, and he was a heartbreaker for me because as a kid I idolized him. It was everything from Fat Albert to his, like, I would listen to his records and just over and over again, and I would memorize like Noah, like his bit about Noah. I probably could recall that entire thing if I attempted to right now, just because it's so deep in there. I loved comedy. I loved making people laugh. But I didn't really ever think of it as a thing I could do, until this strange Sunday afternoon came along and I saw people doing it. So that was it.
Having spent a lot of time in Madison myself, I know that Madison can be extremely proud of itself and self-congratulatory, and also turns out that every now and then something world-class is indeed taking place there. In fact, many times. So we would go see you with my family or whatever, and I remember my dad saying, "This is like world-class comedy. These guys could go to New York. They could go to L.A."
Right.
Still, it's quite a thing to think that this whole generation of you up and moved from Madison to New York.
Like as a collective, it was kind of weird. There was a gang of us.
How many of you left Madison for New York?
Well, ultimately, it was first Josh Lewis, who came and did a year, took some acting classes for a year out here, and he was always the driving force to get people to move here. He was like, "Come on, guys, come on, we got to do it. We got to do it there."
He believed that it could be done.
Yeah, he believed it could be done. He saw it happening.
What did it mean to you? What did it sound like to you the first time it was presented that you guys should move here?
Scary as shit.
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean? Like, at that point, I was making my living off comedy in Madison, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Like, we were doing 5 shows a week, plus we were doing what we would call remote shows. So we would get hired by corporate events, private parties, whatever. But I was getting paid. I was living. I was paying my rent, feeding myself. So why did I need to go to New York? Except it was New York, right? And I hadn't been to New York until the 2 years before I moved here. Just seeing the Empire State Building, I remember from the train and going, oh my God, it's not a picture. It's right there here in front of me. And just the energy of the city, just like it hooked me. It's the most crazy, wonderful, energetic place I'd ever seen or been. And I had to, it was scary and wonderful all at the same time. So I moved here. Josh had flown back to Madison and drove out with me and my friend Graham Willoughby, who is now a very well-known cinematographer, DP, who's shot things like 20 Feet from Stardom, and he worked on the Mr. Rogers movie. Anyway, so me and Graham and Josh pack up our stuff in a U-Haul. And Graham was doing comedy sports back then, too. Graham had never set foot in New York City. We put our stuff in a U-Haul and drove cross country, and Graham drove that U-Haul across the George Washington Bridge into New York.
So you move here and you start to set up a life here, but obviously the intention is you're going to do comedy here.
Yeah.
You have to figure out how to make a living, but you also, you're here to do a thing.
Right,
you're moving
exactly.
to pursue a dream.
So we land in the East Village. Our first apartment was 2nd Avenue between 7th and St. Mark's, and back then the East Village was not what it is today. I mean, you couldn't walk down a block without getting somebody asking you for drugs or wanting to buy drugs.
Right.
At least 3 or 4 times.
Right.
But it was great. It had this great energy. There were all sorts of artists and musicians and all sorts of things happening there. I get a job as a busboy at a bar called Telephone Bar and Grill, 2nd Avenue between 9th and 10th Streets. And they had a little back room, small back room, where they would use it for dining on Fridays and Saturday nights. But during the week, it would sit empty. There it was. So
they have this space, and you convince them somehow that you, busboy, Mark Hervey, just off the U-Haul from Wisconsin, you've got a crew of people who can provide quality entertainment during weeknights in the space.
Barbara Sibley, who was the manager at the place, had become a good friend and still is she's like my New York sister. She was like, yeah, if you can bring people in on a Tuesday night, go for it. So we started doing shows back there, that were not super well attended at first. And then word got out and more people started doing it. Even Jason Sudeikis, that was his first stop, because Jason did comedy sports in Kansas City. So his first stop in New York was to do shows with us.
So comedy sports was kind of a Midwestern thing, right?
It had started in Milwaukee. And then it had spread all over the country. I mean, it's everywhere, almost in any big city now. I mean, it's like in Raleigh-Durham, it's in Los Angeles. It was and there's every year there's a national tournament. I mean, I'm not really so in tune with it anymore, or what's going on with them, but I know it's still rolling in many cities.
But the thing about this thing landing in New York in 1991, 92, 93 is that it also, and especially in the East Village, is that it comes into contact with a kind of comedy generation that is also operating below 14th Street, this kind of alt comedy, new improv scene. So it seems like it was also fortuitous that you chose that time to move and that you ended up in that neighborhood.
Nobody ever plans their life that way, right?
Right.
You don't say, oh, we are in a special time and place and this is going to be magical. Like you're doing what you do and you're following your instincts and you're just doing it. But yeah, so we had the comedy sports show, but we all knew we needed to start writing sketches.
Because comedy sports is totally improvised and it's a kind of...
Yeah, it's ephemeral.
Yeah.
like it's not even jazz in that sense.
Right. Well, the games are like the compositions. The games are the superstructure.
Like right. But there's no way, like once you start repeating yourself, you start to die. And it's, you hate yourself and like if you've repeated something that's coming out of your mouth before. Like,
well, that's an interesting thing. So the way these games work, you'll take suggestions from the audience. There'll be some sort of a general plot setting situation, but then the players in real time have to kind of come up with what's going on stage.
Right, exactly.
Much like playing music, I mean, you start to hate yourself when you start repeating yourself, and yet, just like playing music and improvising music, I mean, at a certain point, you're gonna repeat yourself.
Yeah, at some point you are certain things, but like, even in rock and roll or jazz, whatever, you get to the solo and you got to do the and it's like, how many times are you going to do that to get applause in a certain place? Like, and so...
well, the applause is fresh even if the lick is old. Yeah, I guess that's how people sleep at night.
That's true. That's true.
Nonetheless, we realized
we needed to write because there was no way to sell this thing that we were doing beyond, like I said, it's so ephemeral. It just exists when it does.
So it doesn't scale. In fact, that's the thing, is it doesn't grow. There's nowhere for it to grow.
Right. I mean, the best example of it actually working on television was Whose Line Is It Anyway?
Yep.
And, they sort of cracked that nut.
Yeah.
But that's about as far as you could take it. So we started inviting audiences to stay after Comedy Sports and saying, listen, you don't have to stay. You can if you want, but we're going to come back and do anywhere from 10 minutes to a half hour of sketch comedy. And that was our lab. That was our workshop. So we did that for like a year and a half, and all of a sudden we had all these sketches and we knew what worked and what didn't. And so the jazz part fell away, and we got really good at sticking to the script and just like being really incisive in our writing and how we told jokes and how we delivered them and the physicality of how we were doing it. If something went wrong, we had the chops to just go with it. But it was almost like the opposite of what we were doing. And that eventually became the group, the Bert Furschners, which we rode for like 5 years, had some success on TV and a lot of success on off Broadway. Went all over the country and went to Scotland for the Edinburgh Festival. I mean, that was...
What was the writing like? What did it feel like? Was it provocative? Was it silly? Was it...
There were really no rules. We would write anything from like 12-minute sketches. We wrote songs. We wrote 15-second sketches. So it was all over the map. We were silly as hell. Like people described us as Monty Python meets the Muppet Show, which I thought was a great description. Because consider what was happening at that time. UCB had moved out here. So those guys were around and we were doing shows with them. Mark Maron was coming up. He was Mark Maron. So we were sort of this breath of fresh air that we contrasted
totally
in an era of very acidic and post something comedy, like so anyway,
that's what I'm thinking about. You end up in this is the East Village, this is the 90s, this is a kind of grungy, gritty time in New York. Here come a bunch of these Midwesterners with smiles on their face, singing songs.
Eventually there was a show every Tuesday night down on Ludlow Street where we would come, and it was free, and people would come in, and it was like the workshop where everybody would work on new material there. And so we would be like in between Janeane Garofalo and Mark Maron, And
what did Maron think of you guys?
Oh, he hated us. He loved us, but hated us. Yeah. He loved the fact that was jealous of the fact that we were getting laughs, but he just didn't get it at all. But, here'd come Mark Maron, and then we'd come up and do the Jelly Truck, which was like a 5-minute musical, a Broadway musical compressed, down, and it would kill. But people didn't know how to take it. They were like, what? What is this? And so we stood out. I mean, these Midwestern boys in this really sort of gritty comedy scene. And so we were very insular also, which ultimately was our strength and ultimately our downfall, I think.
So you guys got some kind of a deal, production deal, Comedy Central deal or something?
Yeah, also Saturday Night Live was struggling, so they were looking for the next big comedy thing to come along, sketch group to come along. So we were courted by agents and managers all over. Eventually we signed with 3 Arts with Dave Becky, who's Mr. Big Time now, and was I think he still represents Chris Rock. And
So we
signed with Dave Becky, and we got a contract with Comedy Central to do all sorts of interstitial stuff, and also do a pilot with them, which we did, and tried to translate our stuff to TV. It was a blast. I mean,
you had to be feeling like it's just a question of when and where. But
Right.
It's going to happen. I mean, my memory of watching it from a distance was it's going to happen for these guys. They're just teetering on the edge of this thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, literally, I did quit my job as a waiter at that point. I had moved up from
busboy, right?
But I was waiting tables when we got that contract with Comedy Central. I did quit my job, and I think it was for at least 2-3 years. Again, I was making my living again off of comedy, and not just in Madison, but now in New York.
Yeah, right.
But you come head to head, face to face with the industry and agents and managers and TV networks and what sells and what doesn't. And it starts taking its toll. One thing that we did, one sketch that I'll just tell you about, is we did a Sound of Music parody, and it was just ridiculous. It was relentless. We did My Favorite Things, and we changed the words to veal chops and dill sauce, and just kept repeating it. And then these are a few of my veal chops and dill sauce and veal chops and dill sauce. But we did the choreography and there were 7 of us, and we did we parroted the scene of My Favorite Things and replaced the words with veal chops and dill sauce. And it was funny at first, and then got tiresome, and then it became like ridiculous and hilarious.
Yes.
So we filmed that for a special. And we wanted to close the show with So Long Farewell, where all of us, we in a line, we sing it, and we do the exact thing, right? We do the exact So Long Farewell, Auf Wiedersehen, good night. But we're 7 dudes, and we play ourselves on stage. That was one of the things that we did in the first years. We not only did sketch comedies, but we broke the sketches and then would become ourselves. I would become Mark on stage or in a dress. So it was just us doing that until ultimately the last one, Chris Tallman, who was the the tallest and the biggest of all of us,
played the
smallest, of course. So, and then I come out to try to lift him and carry him up to bed, and I can't. And so I have to get the whole gang to carry him off. And Comedy Central would not let us do it. They said it wasn't parody. We're going to get sued. We're going to get sued. And we got lawyers, and we got their lawyers, and it was like, no, you're going to get sued. And it was like, well, what do you mean? Like, it's... How can this not be? And you have to understand that at this time, while we're having this argument, they're developing South Park. And they have PAs and interns looking up how many times shit and bitch had been said on Saturday Night Live so they can get away with it. So you start seeing
culture
the man
clash
behind
coming,
the curtain. Like, what's really edgy is actually doing So Long Farewell as far as the corporate world is concerned, not saying shit and bitch. Like, that's what they want to do because they want to provoke, and that's going to sell things for them. But really...
But obviously, when you're dealing with corporate money and other people's money,
right,
of course that's going to be what they're concerned about. That has to be a factor. But so what I want to know, though, is so what happens? Because as I say, we're sort of leading up to this thing where there's this inevitability that it's going to happen. And I'm so pleased every time I turn on the television and I see Chris Tallman, and every time I've seen a commercial with Mike Rock in it, who we haven't really talked about, but for me, always behaved as the kind of godfather of the scene.
Right.
Even though I don't know to what extent it behaved that way internally, but for me, I saw it that way. So every time he's now in LA, every time I see him on television, I'm so pleased about it. Nonetheless, there was this sense that this whole scene was going to be, everybody's going to be famous, and it was
Right.
going to, you're going to be on SNL, you're going to be this, you're going to be that.
And a lot of people are from that era. I mean,
Right, but not from the Firstners, but
not
from
from
that
the
era.
Firstners, but from that era.
Right. And is it just the way the cards were dealt, or was there something?
Like I said, I think we were very insular as a group. We built our own props when we did stage shows. We built our own costumes. We built our own sets. We painted our own sets. We wrote all of our music. We recorded it with people we trusted and we knew. We were very insular, whereas UCB, exact opposite. So those guys, Amy Poehler and Matt Walsh being the most recognizable of the original group, those guys were open. Like they were like, let's start a theater, let's train people, let's bring them in, and we did their shows too. We would do their improv, their long form improv with them too. And so I think ultimately that was our downfall. We could not sustain that type of, at least from my view, we just couldn't sustain it. Chris was the first to leave.
He went to LA.
He wanted to move to LA. Our pilot didn't get picked up. They had only one slot, and it was given to
The State?
Yeah,
Oh.
the guys from the State. I think the name of the pilot was like the Le Pen Comedy Hour, but I think they changed it to something else. I forget. It didn't last long. Ultimately, they ended up doing Reno 911, which went for ages and was hilarious.
What's it like? I can speak to this a little bit as in the world of music, where on the one hand, you're so happy when you see your friends succeed, and you understand that when you're kind of in the trenches, anybody who gets out, it's a success for the collective or for the whole. And on the other hand, as you say, there are 3 or 4 or 5 troops that are vying for one slot. What is it like to see your peers and contemporaries finding success, and you're still kind of like waiting for your break?
Well, that was a tough one. Honestly, we had done our pilot. We had offices just down the hall from those guys. And so we were close. They were really, really great. We'd go out for lunch together, drinks every once in a while. And so our pilots were shot within a couple of weeks of each other. And we went to see theirs. They came to see ours. They were in the audience back and forth. And I remember a couple nights after, maybe the week after we had shot our pilot, we were at Caroline's sharing a night, and Tom Lennon came up to me and was like, dude, congratulations. You guys totally killed it. You're totally going to get this. That felt really good because they had already had success,
Yep.
in the business, and they were sort of had their footing. It was a really nice compliment, but I still didn't believe it was going to happen. It was almost like the kiss of death at that point.
But at a certain, and there are those, and Marin, I think maybe at this point, the most famous, who just every time you did a pilot and it didn't get picked up, and every time whatever,
Yeah.
You just picked yourself back up and did it again and did it again and did it again for 10 and 15 years. But what happens with you guys is at a certain point, it kind of starts to
The ship falls
dissolve.
apart. Right. We had no more contract. I can't remember if we had actually gotten dropped by 3 Arts at that point. We may or may not have, but they just weren't paying attention to us either way. They weren't booking us any gigs for us. It seemed like the industry had moved on past us. I got a job writing a couple specials for Comedy Central, and really didn't
see yourself doing that.
Yeah, writing comedy for other people didn't float my boat. I went back to managing restaurants at that point. Honestly, I can say as an individual, seeing the success of others at that point, I always found satisfaction in that. I always cheered on anybody that could do it, especially the good guys. If the guys from the State, like I said, with Reno 911, all of that, seeing all that happen, and then Amy Poehler. I remember running into Amy Poehler on Broadway, Lafayette, the week after she had landed her first thing on Saturday Night Live. giving her a big hug and being like, congratulations, that's so cool. Like it was like people we know are doing this.
Totally. And to an extent, I think it also reinforces your right to be in that scene, to say, look, these are my friends. They dig me. They think we're funny. I mean, I did do the right thing. It wasn't crazy to pursue this dream.
No, it wasn't crazy, and I don't regret a single bit of it. And I do think we were honestly really, really good at what we did, especially live in front of a live audience. They're like, and you know that as a musician, it's like you can record things up and down, left and right, but there's something about the live experience that can never be replaced.
Yes.
And so I think we were that. We were the people that saw us live didn't forget us.
There's something I forgot to bring up, and I guess to ask about, that I was thinking about this morning in going over my memories of seeing the roots of what the Fursteners were, the comedy sports shows in Madison. There was no alcohol in those shows.
No, that's true, because it was
at a Wendy's.
Maybe the Pizza Hut had beer, maybe, but at a Wendy's, no.
But it's really radical. I mean, it's a crazy,
true,
especially in Wisconsin. Wisconsin comedy troupe, and you could drink a Frosty. What are they called? What were those things called?
A Frosty.
Frosty.
Right. Yeah, there was no alcohol at those shows, and that was the thing. It was a family-friendly show.
But in a sense, getting a room full of Wisconsin college students to laugh without booze is like probably the best and hardest thing to do.
Well, yeah.
You can do anything. You can convince any audience of anything after you've been able to do that, you know?
We definitely had chops.
I think there is something to that. The way those dues that you paid positioned you guys to come and be contenders when you came to New York.
Right.
So I moved here in 2005. I don't know when we reconnected, but by the time you and I reconnected, you were an editor.
Yes.
You had become an editor, and you were working on reality TV. You were cutting reality TV shows. The world changed. You obviously had a family. You got married. You found a way to support yourself.
Yeah, I transitioned there. Editing, I would have never thought of it. I didn't even know what it was when I was in Madison. So I had no idea of that career. When I saw this editor, Joe Klotz, editing our special, the Fursteners special, sitting in the editing room with him at one point, I was like, whoa, he could either really screw this up or he could actually make it better.
Yeah.
And he made it better, thankfully. But I saw the power of storytelling through editing. And that really was sort of my first, like, oh, wow, look at what you can do with this. In the wake of the Fursteners, Graham, my DP friend, Graham and I started a monthly comedy show at Galapagos in Brooklyn when it was in Williamsburg. And we invited people to do a 5-minute short film based around a theme, comedic short film based around a theme every month. And it was when editing software was, just coming up, and you could do it. You could get a camera and you could shoot something and make something cool. And so it was a challenge not only to people in the comedy world, but also myself to learn the craft. And so I started doing this more and more.
So you started learning how to cut by making your own short films and then cutting them?
Yeah.
On Final Cut?
Yeah, on Final Cut to begin with. But I was still managing restaurants. Then it all comes back to Telephone Bar. A friend of mine came in, an old friend who had been at NYU Film School, who used to be a line cook when I was a busboy. And he had started a company with a partner. So he comes in, sitting at the bar one night, and I'm managing, and we're talking. And I was like, I wanted to learn a different software program, Avid, which was more of an industry standard. And
but at the time, expensive to get into hardware.
And I knew that he had started this company and was now producing a TV show called Dog the Bounty Hunter, about a bounty hunter in Hawaii who would go after bail jumpers, right? So he's British. And he was like, well, why don't you come work for me? I was like, okay, well, I'm working here. He was like, well, just come in some nights. It's all right, whatever. So really, he gave me my first real exposure to the professional side of the business, not just making videos for myself. And so that was it. I quit my job managing and
And your first job, real professional job editing is editing Dog the Bounty Hunter.
Yeah.
And that's a language. That's a storytelling language.
Yes, I mean, no matter what, you're digging through material for hours. This really was not the way reality TV is done today. I mean, it wasn't the Housewives shows where, you know, producers come and then they say, oh, let's set this table up and we'll do this, and then you get angry at her and you get angry at this, and then you'll have an argument and then somebody pull the tablecloth, right? Like those shows are daytime soap operas,
yeah.
and they're as scripted as they can be. Dog the Bounty Hunter was literally a docuseries about a guy who was catching people who jump bail, right? So we would have camera crews following him around. I mean, we would set up who he was hunting that day, but there was very little, and we didn't do sit-down interviews. We did what we would call OTFs, on the flies. We would interview them as action was happening or get them on camera, but we would never sit them down in a studio and get them to speak in front of a camera and comb their hair and stuff.
I never saw the show. Would you interview the people that he caught also? Would they talk?
Sure.
They'd sign releases?
Yep.
They get paid?
You know, I don't know the contractual.
But that's a crazy thing. What does that say about us as people? That you skip bail, a bounty hunter comes and gets you. When he shows up, there's a camera crew and a producer who shoves a release in front of you, and you talk about it? That's how badly we want to be on TV?
Right. It's kind of nuts, right? It was my job to then make out of hours of these footage, to make a story that was a straight line, A, B, C, D, you know, beginning, middle, end. And sometimes they went all over the place. And my background in writing sketches, in telling stories, improvising on stage, as well as at this point, which we haven't really even talked about, as a musician, and even writing songs, playing in bands, you have to tell a story in 3 minutes or less, you know? So
right, and also I think editing is extremely musical. I think not only in terms of the storytelling piece of it, but just editors, I think, have a rhythm, right?
Right, and this is, I've always said this, is even before I was really into playing bass, is that editing is like playing bass. If you're being noticed, if people notice what you're doing it wrong. You know, every once in a while you pop out and do a really cool bass riff, right? Mm-hmm. Or some songs you don't even know are a bass riff.
I mean, do you ever say to yourself, I don't know if I would ever watch this show? Or, you know what I mean? Like, does it matter what the content is?
No. I mean, you probably know this as a writer of
commercial
music. You go like, I wouldn't have written this otherwise, but this is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I really don't watch that much TV. Yeah. And I don't really watch the shows that I make, except for maybe a few every once in a while that I'll be like, oh, now that one, you know. But really, this is my job. It gives me creative satisfaction. It feeds my family, thank God. And I'm able to still create in other areas of my life and enjoy playing in a band, making bread, cooking. You know what I mean? There's all sorts of, the older I get, the more places I see.
Well, and it's a very American and a very New York idea that somehow success is measured by whether or not you're able to tie up all of your passions into a thing that also is financially successful.
Right.
You know, what do you do as opposed to who are you?
Exactly. And editing is my job now, and I happen to really like my job, and I love certain things about it. I don't like other things, but I guess that's how it goes. But I love storytelling.
What are the contracts like for you? What kind of control do you have over your career in these situations?
Well, I mean, you sign a normal boilerplate contract. Like, you know, as a musician, usually, I mean, we've discussed this a little bit, but as a musician, usually when your song is used in television or in movies, you get certain royalties. As an editor, that doesn't happen.
Right.
You basically are signing away your work.
Are you guaranteed to any credit?
That's the funny thing, is the contract says they can credit you as they wish, most contracts. But I've never done a job where, except for now, which we will come to probably, I've not gotten proper credit as an editor or multiple editors working.
Right. So if there are 6 editors working on a show, 6 editors are credited, whatever.
On the show. So yeah, which, brings us to the discussion that we had a few months ago.
Right. I mean, the other piece of it that I want to just preface before we get there is to say, I think that same as in music, same as in film, same as in anything, there are also these kind of standout examples in any field of like the high watermark, the high bar of something. And in the world of reality TV, there are some shows that emerge that you go, that's a classy show. That's an example of how this thing can be elevated.
Right. Of course, there's different levels in there. Like some shows are easier to put together than others. Some shows are classier than others. And every once in a while, you have a gem.
Right.
Like what we're getting to here is something like Parts Unknown.
Right.
Where all of a sudden, because of not only the production company and the way it's produced, but also the personality in Anthony Bourdain, all of a sudden you had this magical convergence of creativity and boom. It's shot beautifully. He's funny. He digs in. He's able to interview people and pull out what he really wants to out of them, and is able to carry what should be a fairly boring show about food and travel, but he was the key to it. Like he brought it to life in a way that I don't think anybody could have, and people have tried before and since. And that show, as most editors in the business and people that I work with know, that show is very insular in that they've always kept a small crew of people, editors, producers, that work on the show. Mostly, I think, because Bourdain wanted it that way. He likes to work with people he trusts, and that's the way it was. So to land a job on that show was like a bit of a holy grail within the industry, within my profession. Which brings us to, I landed one a couple years ago. It was around about this time 2 years ago. I landed on Parts Unknown. Again, I had a friend at the production company. I would, send out emails when I was looking at a hole in my schedule and be like, oh, I'm not booked. Send out emails to producers, friends in the industry, and say, fishing. And she would almost inevitably send back, say, sorry, nothing. But she's a good friend, and I would always
try.
This time I almost left her off, but boom, right away I got an answer back. So ultimately, they were looking for an editor to come in and do this episode about the Lower East Side of New York, and it was going to be a very special episode. It was going to be off format, as they say. It wasn't going to be a regular, it wasn't going to be about food and travel. Anthony or Tony, everybody called him Tony at the company. Tony wanted to look back at his time in the 1970s and 80s, coming up as a chef on the Lower East Side, and basically sort of map the changes from then until now. So I was like, I'm the guy. I'm the guy to do this episode. I had landed in the East Village, even though it was later, it was still the kind of gritty, creative place that he had come up through. Although it was a bit more gritty back then, still I knew the places and the people that he was going to be interviewing. So I was like, oh man, if I don't land this one, I can't land anything. So they set up an interview with me, and I met the director. We talked for a long time, for about an hour, and we hit it off. And
these are like little short films, really, right? I mean,
they're hour-long shorts, really. And he was going to do 12, I think he did probably more than that. There were some interviews that fell out. But I think ultimately there were 12 interviews in the episode, which was a lot. and it was going to be archive heavy. Usually there were not 12 interviews in A Parts Unknown. Like, he would travel places. Sometimes he would travel with a friend, or he would travel places. He would talk to people, but actual sit-down interviews.
Yeah. How long were the interviews that he did it for?
Long. Like, some were, like the one with Richard Hell was like 3 hours.
Wow.
And that was, whew.
And you're looking for 10 minutes. Not
even 3 to 5, maybe, if you can pull it out of there.
Wow.
Jim Jarmusch and Amos Poe, Harley Flanagan.
So what's happened? So in those interviews, 3 hours with Richard Hell, is somebody logging it first?
No.
You're just watching it?
No, I'm watching it.
You're watching
ultimately,
3 hours.
My first day on the job, I'm just watching interviews because ultimately they'll get transcribed.
Yeah.
At some point, they're processing, so a PA will transcribe all the interviews, so that later in the process I could do a word search and maybe try to find some sort of key. But I'm just watching everything. I watch everything and taking detailed notes on each interview, and with time codes and where I can find stuff.
What kind of direction are you given?
At this point, I'm given, like at the beginning, I was given a act by act from the director, who was really my only collaborator. It was like, here, this is how I want it to go.
But out of those 3 hours or 2 hours, whatever it is, however long it is, does the director say to you, I think I remember him talking about this or that?
Sure. Yeah. Every once in a while, he'd be like, yeah, maybe you can try it. He'll be like, oh, I loved this part. I really want you to try to fit that in. Okay, cool. So I will make a note on that. And so through that process, I start editing it down. And then sometimes he sees stuff that he asked for and then goes, yeah, that's not really working. Let's just cut that out.
Yeah.
I remember that better than how it really was, or I might find something that I think is great. And I'm like, oh, this really has to go in because it can pay off later here and this and that. Or even like, what if we switch the order here and we actually start with this interview and then go to this? And usually all those suggestions were taken in stride, and I was given a lot of creative freedom in how the interviews were put together and the content, how the main story arc of the hour-long episode was to go. And so it was awesome. It was some of the best work I've ever done. And I got to look through all of this archival footage that was amazing. Like, he had done interviews with Debbie Harry and Christina Blondie and Fab Five Freddy. So there was all this footage, and they were collaborators back in the day. And there was this cable access TV show that they did called TV Party, that everybody was dropping by, and there was photographs. There was thousands of photographs that I went through of like Brian Eno at this show, and Robert Fripp and David Byrne and Basquiat, and they're all hanging out together with Debbie Harry and Jim Jarmusch, like all of these people, all just like.
So you're cutting this. This is some of the best work you've done. This sounds like an incredible fit for you, and it sounds like also a massive undertaking to go through all this stuff.
Yeah. It was huge. It was huge. I feel like, again, I feel like I had broken into another level. It was like, oh, this is great. And I knew I could do it. Like, I knew I was like, I had the chops at this point to really make it work. So I had cut the entire show together with temporary music and had turned in the rough cut, what we call the rough cut, to CNN on the Tuesday before he died. So that Tuesday I had turned it in, but there was still work to do. I was still going through archival stuff. Basically what would happen at that point is that CNN then would give notes back. And what had also happened at that point is that Tony had watched the whole thing, and he had finished his narration for the first 3 acts of the show. The last 3 acts I had put in temporary narration, had written and put in temporary narration. He would always come in and write his own narration and hopefully hit the points that
that are connecting these scenes.
But he liked the show. He liked it enough to narrate the first 3 acts, and he had signed off on the last 3 acts and was due to come back to New York the following Tuesday and finish the narration for those last 3 acts. So that essentially it was the morning. Was it the Thursday or Friday morning? I don't even know. But I was in the kitchen, and as is our tradition, the radio's on NPR in the morning, and my son shouted from the kitchen table like, "Dad, they're talking about your show." And I went in there, and he was 13 at the time, and right there they said on the radio, Bourdain is dead by apparent suicide in France. And I just slumped in my chair and just like I lost it. It was surreal. Not just because I was working on the show, it was like I had been inhabiting, I mean, I at this point had worked on the show for 2 months, and every day for hours and hours I had been sitting with this man, not physically, but you inhabit the characters and you care about them and you care about the work that you're doing. And the other thing is up to this point in my life, the last 5 years up to this point, I had gone through a period where I lost a lot of close friends, as well as my father. So I was very in touch with death, let's say, in the process. And one of them, especially the drummer in my band, who I had witnessed, like he had had cancer and he wanted to die at home with his friends, and me and 2 other guys were with him when he went. And so I knew what, I was highly familiar and in touch with the emotions of shedding this mortal coil, you know, with the emotions of those who are left to deal with it. But I didn't know what else to do, so I went to work. I knew that if that show were to exist, we didn't have his narration in the last 3 acts of the show. We didn't have his voice. And there was information we needed to put in there if that wasn't the case. So I knew the interviews. I had detailed notes on them all, and I knew the information we needed that I could re-edit those last 3 acts without his narration. I could see it. I went into the office that day. It was, again, I don't know how much I even got done that day, but because everybody, like, it was like a bomb went off, you know, and the even the future of the production company was being questioned because they're not a big company. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, I spent the next few days of work while things were sort of in limbo, re-editing those last 3 acts without his voice, putting in the information that needed to be put in and sort of making it work. Then got word that the show would be ultimately put on hold. The production company was going to put the show on hold for indefinitely until they figured out what they were going to do with the network. Mm-hmm. So, you know, they kindly paid me for the rest of the week, sent me home, you know, and that was it.
In your experience of loss, of death, did you come to understand that going to work was like a survival mechanism, a defense mechanism? The one thing that you can do in the face of loss is continue to work? Or what do you think was sending you to work?
In a way, yeah. I mean, the biggest honor I think that you can pay the dead is to keep living, right? Mm-hmm. My life didn't stop. I wasn't trying to mask anything. I wasn't running away from it. I was trying to continue to create. I was trying to continue to honor both the job I had done and my creative self. I know this enough that we, as individuals, we all deal with death in different ways, and how we put our reaction to it. And that was my reaction. I have no regrets for how I reacted to that. That's how I did.
Oh, I don't ask about it in terms of regretting it. More just looking back on it and saying,
yeah,
look, I have experienced very little loss. When I hear you say we all experience death in our own way, the first thing I think is like, how will I handle this when somebody who I'm really close to goes? I mean, I have lost friends. But nothing that, you know, I wake up in the morning and I have those first 10 seconds of my eyes being open before I remember again that the person is gone.
Right.
That kind of thing. I mean, my only example of that is heartbreak. So, and I, from those times in my life when I lost a relationship, I can't imagine what that's going to be like for me. And
right.
No matter how much preparing you do in your life for it, it's like you're not really prepared until.
Yeah, it's like being a father. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's right. When I say those words, that's what I think, right?
Right. I mean, you can tell friends who are expecting, like, oh, yeah, your life's going to change. Yeah. But they don't know what it's like until it happens. And that's it. And so, like, I didn't know my reaction until my reaction became
your reaction, right?
My reaction. But again, it became a bit more predictable just because I knew I had been through it. Like, literally, my friend Beckley, when he passed, it was on a Saturday night into a Sunday morning, and I came home that morning and I told my family, and my son was very close with him, and that was really difficult. I slept the day and got up and ate, and then that Monday morning I went to work again. Yeah. At that point I was working on videos for Major League Soccer, profiles of players and coaches. And again, even then, my boss knew, my friend was sick, so that was the first thing he had asked me when I came in, and I told him what had happened. And
in the case of Bourdain, I mean, everybody was experiencing that loss at the same time, and
that was super intense.
That's super intense.
Not only the people in the company, but the whole world was mourning him.
Well, that's what I think is so powerful about the story. We're hearing this story and seeing this story through your eyes and through your experience, and I can imagine that because you were so wrapped up in the project, as you say, you had sort of embodied him. You became his voice to a certain extent, at least in this episode.
Right.
And it's so intertwined with your own personal experience of having spent time in the East Village. And, there's all of these kind of interweaving things, not to mention what it represented to you professionally and how it felt personally to be telling that story. I mean, look, my heart sank when I found out about Bourdain and so many people. It was a huge loss. I felt so sad and such a loss.
Because we all wanted to be him.
Yes.
Right?
Well, that's what's so confusing about it. That's what's so confusing about it.
Oh.
Hearing it through your telling, I could see how it would be so intense. And then there's this professional piece of it.
Yeah. I'm just going to preface this by saying that a few months ago, I called you up or texted you or whatever, and it was like, dude, can we talk?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just because, not because I didn't want you to interview me. Because I listened to your podcast, like we're old friends.
Yeah.
And I listened to your podcast and I love it. And I needed therapy. I needed to tell this story, and I needed somebody to ask me smart questions about it, and I needed some clarity in my thought process, and I wasn't sure how to make these decisions. And even back then, you said, "Oh, maybe you should do the podcast."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Yeah, I don't know." I'm not sure I want to make this public. And I've gone back and forth, and even in the last few days, because it's a painful thing to recall, and it's a weird story. I'll go back and say that was super helpful, actually. Talking to you that day when we met at the restaurant and sat at the bar and had a couple glasses of wine.
Yeah, it
was super helpful and clarifying. That was a moment.
Wow, thank you.
I needed that.
Good. I'm glad it was helpful. That makes me feel good.
Yeah. What happened was the show was put on hold. I had another week before I started another job. So, and that job went through January, and this was June? Was it May? Around that time. June. It must have been June. So I was starting another job, and I knew I couldn't drop that other job to come back to finish this episode. So I basically offered, like, I will work around it. I will come in nights, weekends, whatever, because the show was close to being done. It was so close, I could taste it. Like, it was really getting there. And like, it would be some music changes, basically, because they had somebody composing music, maybe some additions. I would have to maybe re-edit the first 3 acts if they didn't want to use the narration there, and then find those parts in the interviews that we could use. I basically begged and was like, please, 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 But the director had been with Tony in France, the director of my episode. He had been with Tony in France. They were close friends. He was highly affected, obviously. Eventually, I was told by the executive producer in an email that one of their senior editors who had been there since it was on the Travel Channel as no reservations was going to finish the episode, which was disappointing but understandable because I know that this editor and this director had shorthand.
Yeah.
They both knew Tony, had a personal relationship with him, and so I respected that. I was like, I get it. And he was also available.
Not just nights. But...
Yeah, not just nights, coming in nights to finish the episode. They had also shot a lot of stuff around the neighborhood. Like they'd shot these other little vignettes, which I had cut, but they had eventually fallen out of the show because of time. Mm-hmm. Because the interviews really were the thing, were the bedrock of the show. So those had fallen away. But I had found out later that CNN basically said, okay,
however long
the show needs to be, it needs to be, and that they slated this to be the last episode of Parts Unknown. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. And I must say that the interviews that he was conducting were quite existential in nature.
Looking back,
there were even certain things that I pulled out that were just a little too harsh that week between his death and me leaving the show.
You went back in and pulled some things out that just seemed a little...
Yeah, it was just like, that's a little, just going to ring a little too harshly. Anyway, fast forward to, I think they start putting up posters and billboards and stuff around the city that the last episode is going to air in November and blah, blah, blah. I sent an email to the director, thanking him for everything and hoped he was well. I mean, we really hadn't had any contact, except for once where I had gone in to interview with another producer on another show at the same company. Uh-huh. And he and I had run into each other, and he was still obviously really, really kind of reeling from it. Didn't hear back. The night of the airing of the show, my wife and I are watching it, and...
So this is like a year ago, a little over a year ago now.
So yeah, I guess it's a little over a year ago. My wife and I are watching the show. They added those vignettes that I said at the beginning of each act, but really the interviews remained as I had cut them. In the second act, they had taken Fab Five Freddy and then Debbie Harry Chris Stein, which were 2 separate interviews, and had intercut them, meaning it went Freddy, Debbie Harry Chris Stein, back to Freddy, and then back to Debbie Harry Chris Stein, and then back to Freddy, right?
Are the pieces that they're using of those interviews?
But the pieces they used are exactly how I had left them.
Out of hours and hours of conversations.
And then Act 3, exactly the same. Act 4, exactly the same. Again, it was done now. There was music in that had been composed now. They have a graphics department, and they put in, some fancy moves on pictures. But a lot of even the archival stuff that I had chosen was still there. The interviews were the same. Maybe small edits here and there for time. Things falling out. But really, I was like, wow, that was really, they really stayed true to my original cut. That's so cool. They really honored the work that had gone before. I got to the end. My wife says, wait. Hit rewind. I was like, why? She was like, your name wasn't there. I mean, what do you mean my name wasn't there? She was in your name. I was like, no, the credits go so fast. You just didn't see it. She was like, come on, rewind it. She was like, of course they credited me. She made me rewind it. I looked. My name wasn't there. Nowhere. Not even nothing. So I contact the company, and they apologize. They say, oh, we'll give you credit. We're going to give you an additional editor credit, which really isn't... At this point, that's not really a thing. But I say, okay, they say that they're going to pull the originals from CNN.
Just to add this credit back
to add the credit back in. And I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing that you'll even do that. But it was like weird. And also I start doubting myself too. I start going, well, what did he really change it that much? Is it really that different? But so like you start doubting, creative types can be kind of insecure at times.
Sure. Sure. At times.
So whatever, I'm happy that they said that they were going to make the change. Fast forward a number of months later, Emmy nominations come out. And I see that the show is up for outstanding editing.
This particular episode.
This episode's, not the series. Yeah. This episode. And my name isn't anywhere to be found. And at this point, they haven't changed anything. And now it's on all the streaming services and without any credit whatsoever. So my name isn't anywhere to be found on this thing.
Is it on your IMDb page? Has it been updated there?
Nope. It's not on the IMDb page. It's not it's nowhere. It's like I'm a ghost. It's mixed up with all these crazy emotions of like, wow, this is the best work I've ever done. Some of the best work I've ever done. How do I even react to this? And so I contact the company again. They say, oh, we don't know how that slipped through the cracks. I was like, well, really, my name should be submitted alongside the other name. And they were like, no, it changed so much. And I was like, it actually didn't. And they said, no, it really, really has. And I was like, well, maybe it has. And then I went, you know what? I saved a copy. I saved a copy of my episode. And I went back and I watched it. And I was like, it hasn't changed. So I did a quick over the next few days, and this was all, it's all mixed up with like, I don't even want to remember this stuff, and I'm sure they don't want to go back and revisit it either. Yeah. Like, I can't even watch the show now. Yeah. Like, I didn't watch any other episodes except for that one, because, and I've heard this from other people too, it's mixed up with a lot of painful emotions. Totally. Right? And now it's even more.
And now it's mixed up also with this self-doubt and this questioning, and am I being petty for doing this? And also,
right. And to what end?
To what end? But considering who we're talking about, what would Tony say?
Like, what would he do? What would Tony do?
Fucking do in a situation where his work isn't credited, the best work of his life?
Right.
What does he represent to us? Why do we all want to be him?
Because he always spoke up. He was a different character than I am, and I have a different kind of heart, and I'll put it that way. But I think one of the things that everybody admired about him was that he just didn't, he said what he said, and he didn't pull any punches. And he did it with love and caring as well. He wasn't cruel, but he was straightforward in love, and that's what love is sometimes, whatever. Long story short, ultimately, I edited together my cut with their cut and put it in a small window and a big window and sent them links and said, look, I've put together the shows and they sync up pretty dang close. Of course, small changes, but as far as editing goes, minor. The things that were added, again, were music and the additional vignettes and recuts of transitions, and also the opening of the show. He used classical music to open the show. But I showed several of my editor friends what I had done, just to sort of like, am I crazy here? And they were like, dude,
yeah,
no, you're not crazy. That's insane. That's insane. Like, everybody I've ever showed it to has gone, yeah, that's not right.
And it must scare the shit out of your editor friends too to look at that, because you realize that you could do this work and not be credited for it.
And ultimately I did sign a contract that said they can credit me as they wish, so I have no leg to stand on. So it's weird. Ultimately, it was nominated but didn't win, which, again, I felt a really weird feeling. Like, well, what do you mean it didn't win? like I had that mixed emotion of like, well, that's my work. What do you mean it didn't win? That was,
I mean, was there a sense of it, not that it wasn't great work, but was there a sense of it that maybe part of the reason it was nominated was because it was a way to pay some tribute to honor him? Or
yes,
they nominated...
I have no doubt. Like, it's all sort of political. Ultimately, and I really don't want this to be about, like, I'm not trying to get back and make anybody feel bad or whatever. I asked the company to actually either put my name alongside his or pull the nomination. I don't care.
Yeah.
Just it didn't seem right to me that somebody else was taking full credit for something that they didn't do. And I know that this wasn't the editor's choice. It was the company's choice to do this.
I think one of the things that we talked about when you first told me the story was also what one does as a parent when your kids, who I'm sure understood what this meant to you and followed the whole thing and then saw this go down. It's like, well, what's the message that I want to present about the world? And at a certain point, your kids are old enough now, they're going to have their own message about what the world is and isn't.
Yeah, but they're old enough to understand too. Like, they're 15 and 13 now. And so they were just a couple years younger than, again, just a year younger. Like, so they're
watching
smart.
this. Yes.
Yeah, they're smart, creative, interesting human beings.
What did they think you should do?
Well, I had people telling me I should sue, for future damages, because it's hard to even put on a resume, because how do you prove that I even did this?
Because you should be an Emmy-nominated editor at this point.
Yeah, but from being an Oscar-winning song producer that awards don't put food on the table. Right? Like
the only thing it does is if you are on an airplane next to a stranger and they say, "Have you ever done anything that I've heard of?"
Right.
Or if you're talking to somebody who's
still
vibing.
Say that.
Yes, you can.
But it's still it's just a weird place to be. Like I just got ghosted, I'm just gone.
Professionally ghosted.
Professionally ghosted from the best work I've done, which is a strange feeling. And I don't think any amount of complaining or suing or whatever is going to change that. The fact is, Pandora's box has been opened. Nobody's going to pull this from iTunes or Netflix or Google Play and put my name on it. So it's done. It's a done deal.
It's a done deal. The thing is, your work does matter. Sometimes your work matters to you more than other times, but your work is meaningful. And so it's not petty to try to figure out and feel powerless and helpless and think, what can I possibly do?
Right. But I want to say this, considering how much grief I went through in those years leading up to that, and how emotionally I was affected from Bourdain's death. Imagine the director, the editor, the executive producer, all the people at this company that actually had a personal relationship with him. And I'm asking them to go back and look at this material again, where Tony is speaking existentially about the loss of his beloved East Village and his beloved New York. That's a big ask. And so for me to make the decision to actually litigate through this, I'm not that person.
You ultimately decided not to.
Ultimately, they're human beings too, and their pain is as real as all of ours. And no matter what I do, it's not going to bring any sort of satisfactory resolution. There is no satisfactory resolution. And maybe that's the takeaway from it all, is that death has no satisfactory resolution. We continue to live unresolved, right? All of us who are left behind will continue to be unresolved until we go, It's a 1, 5, 4 left right there, It never gets back to the 1. When I came to realize that, and partially was through our conversation a few months ago, I'm not getting my dad back. I'm not getting Beckley back. I'm not getting my friend Carol back. I'm not getting my friend Deb back. I'm not getting Bourdain back. I'm not getting my credit on that show. All I have is this moment and what I choose to create in the future. So if there's anything to take away from that, there's no amount of money or vindication or awards or anything that could close that book. Done. In that sense. It doesn't mean that I don't still have feelings about it. In fact, when you contacted me again to do this, I'd almost sort of let it be. And then I was like, well, maybe I should do, okay. And it's funny because I didn't see your initial email to me. And then you emailed me a week later and I was like, oh yeah. After that, it's affected me emotionally having to, like I went back and read what I had written down about it. And then I was going to watch the shows again, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I mean, even over these 2 weeks, it's really affected me emotionally. But I knew ultimately talking about it again with you and actually making a record of it was probably a smart thing to do.
Well, when we first talked about it, I mean, one of the unknowns is now known, which is this thing going to win an Emmy, which would have been an even more bitter pill to swallow, although it sounds to me that by that time you had sort of reached a certain understanding of what it really meant to you and how you wanted to approach it.
Well, ultimately, too, whether it won an Emmy or not, it was nominated.
Yeah.
So that's very few editors in my field are nominated for outstanding editing. Like, so that is quite an honor.
Deal.
A big deal in and of itself. So whether it won or not, really, for me, has no bearing on. Like I said, I actually felt. My initial feeling was like, "What do you mean?"
Yeah. Right.
It's good work. Win? That was really good.
You don't really totally get rewarded for your years of experience as a freelance creative. You just have to keep doing the work, you know?
Right. Yeah.
At the end of the day, you're going to get paid a rate. I'm going to get paid a rate. And basically, we're just going to have to hope that, you know, the work stays good.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And you take the recognition that you get, because ultimately, in the end, what is recognition? What is it worth? What is it? You move forward, is what I'm saying. That's the past.
You cannot afford to get hung up on any of those.
Yeah,
those things.
That's the past. What's happening is happening. You know, what's now is now. What is going to be will become what you make it.
Mark Hervey.
Leo Sidran.
Thank you for making this the way we spent our morning.
Yeah, that was good.
There it was, my talk with Mark Hervey. I'll be back again next week with another deep dive. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.